Good morning. My wife, Melissa, and I, she's here in the front row, we bought our first house a few years ago. It's just a nice little place, and it was right in our budget, which naturally meant that it was a wreck. And we spent a lot of time, especially my wife, did tons and tons of work renovating the whole place. But when we first bought it, we decided we were going to undertake one specific project as our very first one. And there were a number of reasons for that, but we decided that we were going to install one of those pull-down attic ladders, like the one that so vexes Clark Griswold in Christmas Vacation. We were going to put one of those in, and I read some tutorials, and I watched some YouTube videos, and it seems pretty straightforward, right? I knew the steps, right? You just cut out a few things and you put it in, you screw it in, and you're done. And so I may not be the handiest of renovators, but in that moment, I had the confidence of a man armed with some YouTube videos, and I was not going to be deterred. I think in that moment, I probably could have landed a plane too. And it was a Thursday evening. I figured we'll stop by after work. We'll install this thing real quick, and then we'll run back to where we were living for dinner. It can't take more than, 30 minutes? 45 tops? But when my YouTube-informed plans met the reality of our 19th century house, it got a little bit more complicated. And by 11 o'clock that night, it had been installed and then uninstalled and then reinstalled several times over. There was great weeping and gnashing of teeth, but in the end, that ladder was successfully implanted in our ceiling. The trim and the paint is still not done 2 years later, but that is beside the point. See, the point is that the plan I had, that clear idea, the ideal of how this was going to work out, it was so simple. And it was so straightforward, as they always are. But the reality of the situation was messy and complicated and way more frustrating than I expected it to be. Well, as we were hearing the text read this morning, I think that we see a similar tension in the text, but blessedly has nothing to do with home renovation. Instead, in the text that we heard read this morning, we hear an ideal, something so clear and simple, and it's the ideal of how the people of God are meant to model love. Specifically, how love is embodied in the act of forgiveness. But then we also heard a story of those ideals meeting practice. The reality, the messy reality of life. And so first, in the gospel reading from Luke chapter 6, we find ourselves in the midst of Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, as he often does, summarizes a difficult and complex idea in a succinct fashion. He says, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." And as if it were just as easy as that, he goes on in the next few verses to give just a little bit more detail about what that actually looks like. And in the center section of the passage, Jesus contrasts that idea of love your enemies and do good to those who hate you with what we could say is, love of friends. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. It's perhaps oddly simplistic to say that it's natural for us to act with love towards those we already love. This is not an action that's unique to the people of God, but is practiced by all. We act kind and gracious and merciful towards those we already like. I like my friends, and so I act from a place of love for them. If they wrong me, I forgive them. If they need help, I offer my unconditional aid and give without requiring payment, and I imagine you do the same. It's common to our human nature. But Jesus calls us to go beyond that, to expand the scope of those who are to be the recipients of our love. The ideal that he sets forth for the people of God is not just to love those who we are predisposed to do so, but to also love those that, if we're honest with ourselves, it would be much easier to hate. Love your enemies, those who hate you, speak terrible things about you, strike you, take from you, or try to take advantage of you. And we may try to be holy people and say that we hate no one. But as we reflect on those descriptions that Jesus outlines, I imagine there were, just for a brief, fleeting second, perhaps a name or a face that popped into your mind. Perhaps it was a coworker, a neighbor, or most difficult of all, a family member. Those people that it would be so much easier to not act with love towards. And as we move from the ideal to the reality of our lives, we sense the messiness begin to creep in. But before we turn to the next passage, there's one more aspect of Jesus' directives that's worth noting. The end of this section on the Sermon on the Mount revisits how the people of God are to embody love. But instead of focusing on our response to others' actions, the focus is on our actions. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. And while each of these statements are important, I'd like for us to focus on the third. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Jesus takes the ideal of love your enemies and describes a practical and clear way that that love is embodied and acted upon by the people of God. We could say that forgiveness is a sub-discipline of love. We put love into action when that action is one of forgiveness. And again, this concise and simple statement by Jesus is one that pushes beyond the bounds of our comfort zone. It was easy to forgive my coworker Jeff when he hit me with a really heavy suitcase at work the other day. Because, well, I like Jeff. He's a nice guy. But how do I forgive those who've hurt me that perhaps I don't feel the same way about? How do I forgive those that have hurt those that I love? How do I forgive those who have destroyed a dream long in the making? How do I forgive those who are actively trying to hurt those in my community? And in the midst of these familiar questions, the messiness of life reappears. And so as we turn to the story of Joseph, we see this ideal put into practice. So the story of Joseph would be funny if it weren't at the same time so tragic. Joseph, in the beginning, seems to lack all social awareness and proclaims to his brothers that he will someday rule over them, thinking that they're going to respond like, yeah, that sounds great. See, he had a dream where his bundle of wheat remained standing and their bundles bowed down to him. And after the second such dream and proclamation, his father, who loved him more than all of the others, turned to him and said, "That's a little much, Joseph." His brothers, enraged by his seemingly self-aggrandizement, take the reasonable course of action of plotting to murder him. But their actions are tempered just a little bit by Reuben, and they settle for selling him into slavery instead of murder. Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he takes a long and winding path that includes a short 2-year pit stop in jail, and ends up and the heights of power. He ends up being among the most powerful people in Egypt and is successfully leading them through a famine with provisions that he stored after once again utilizing his ability to interpret dreams. And the drama of the story reaches new heights as Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, seeking food so that they can survive the famine. And Joseph recognizes them immediately, but they don't recognize him. Joseph, not having heard the Sermon on the Mount, does not default to forgiveness and instead seems to kind of mess with his brothers for a while. In the version that I learned growing up, Joseph, the cucumber, replaces he replaces the pepperoni on the pizzas his brothers received with gold coins, right? I think that VeggieTales may have changed some of the details along the way, but the idea is similar. We're looking at Joseph's actions, that he's messing with his brothers and pulling them back and forth, and it makes us wonder, is he going to choose the path of forgiveness or the path of vengeance and revenge? Will Joseph love his brothers, who we could say acted like his enemies, or will he hate them in return? And the climax of the story was the reading from this morning. After an impassioned speech by Judah begging for the life of his younger brother Benjamin to be spared, Joseph can contain himself no longer. And he reveals his identity to his brothers. He asks about their father, and he tells them that God had used their actions for good, that he will care for them, given his newfound power and prominence. And at the end of Joseph's speech, there are this pair of verses that have long fascinated me. And I think they capture the messiness of forgiveness. In verses 14 and 15, we see the actions of Joseph and his brothers in response to the revelation of Joseph's identity. Joseph first approaches Benjamin, the youngest brother, born after Joseph had been sold into slavery, and he falls on Benjamin's neck and weeps. Benjamin, in turn, weeps upon Joseph's neck. And this interaction seems to symbolize the love and reconciliation between the two. Joseph loves his brother Benjamin, and Benjamin, in return, loves his brother Joseph. There's nothing to forgive between them, and the reconciliation is quick and easy. Joseph then turns to his other brothers, the ones that sold him into slavery all those years before. And he repeats the same actions. He falls on their necks and weeps. And in return, we're simply told that after that, his brothers talked with him. If weeping in this moment is a symbol of love embodied in forgiveness and reconciliation, we're left to wonder if reconciliation has actually been achieved. Joseph has forgiven his brothers, but have the brothers accepted that forgiveness? In the following chapters, we get an answer to this question as Joseph's brothers question the sincerity of Joseph's love and forgiveness that we know to be genuine. And so the road to love and forgiveness in the story of Joseph is messy and realistic. It takes him time and searching inwardly to arrive at a place where he can offer love and forgiveness. But when that love and forgiveness is offered, it's not accepted as enthusiastically as we would have liked. The celebration is muted, and reconciliation is delayed, if ever truly achieved. The ideal is so clear and so straightforward. Love your enemies and embody that love in acts of forgiveness, but the reality of putting that into practice is anything but clear and straightforward. And so as we reflect on these passages this morning, I'd like to take just a moment to further examine how they interact with where we find ourselves in life today. First, forgiveness as an act or an embodied act of love is an essential part of being the people of God. In addition to Jesus' clear statement here in the Sermon on the Mount, if we were to peek ahead just a little bit in the story of the gospel, we see Jesus himself putting this practice, or practicing this ideal. The ultimate act of love in the gospel, Christ crucified, also includes an act of forgiveness as Jesus uttered from the cross, "Forgive them, Father." Our acts of love and forgiveness may not seem as grand, but are not unimportant. While it is a common human experience to be recipients of hurt, anger, and hatred, the world that we experience today is one that seems more divided and angry than ever, creating fertile ground for enemies to be created. They can be in the form of those on the other side of the political aisle, family members with different ideals from us, or any other number of potential contexts. But we are again reminded that for the people of God, love is a necessity, and the act of forgiveness is not to be contained within the relationships we have with those that we are predisposed to love. Next, the messiness of Joseph's story also reminds us that forgiveness is not a straight path through the wilderness. We're to embody love and forgiveness, but our act of forgiveness does not mean that we get to dictate how others respond to it. As the Spirit is at work in our lives, conforming us more and more into Christ's likeness, it is the Spirit and not us that is at work in the lives of others. And also, love embodied in forgiveness does not necessitate sacred amnesia. Forgiveness does not mean allowing abuse to continue, either of others or ourselves. And lastly, if I may contextualize the passage a step further, some of us may need to consider that the enemy that we are being called to love and forgive is ourselves. The enemy that may curse us and strike us may be one of our own making inside our own minds and spirits. That enemy may be the most difficult to love and forgive, but it's not in some separate category set apart from our call to be the people known of love and forgiveness. And so now we'll take a few moments to reflect on the readings that we've heard this morning.